Well, good morning. To those of you in Medina, online, good morning to you as well. Today's message is going to have 4 points, and I'm just going to give them to you right now. Be good, do good, God bless, and go Bills. I'm definitely going to need a t-shirt or a tattoo or something that says all those things, because what a beautiful statement. But anyways, good morning. It's good to see you. Several years ago, when I was a youth pastor here at the church, probably going back maybe 12 years ago, I'd first started, and I got this call from a parent that had some concerns. And anytime as a youth pastor you get a call from a concerned parent, it's like, oh man, what did I do? What did I say? Like, it's just like all of a sudden you get nervous. But this time it had nothing to do with anything I had said. It was something that their daughter had said. And the parent asked if I would meet with their daughter just to talk about these concerns. A lot of times when I would get those calls, it would be like, can you fix my kid for me? So I'm like, yeah, like I would love to meet with your daughter. I would love to talk about whatever's going on. And I remember when they walked in, the mom, dad, and the daughter comes in kind of head down. You could just tell she was feeling ashamed. And the parent said to me, my daughter's no longer a Christian. Will you talk to her? I was like, yeah, of course. And so we sat down and I asked her, what's going on? Like, tell me what you're thinking. What's going on in your head? And she said she was learning in school and doing some research and some reading about evolution. And she said she was believing what she was learning. And I said, okay, I get that, but your parents said, like, you're struggling with your faith, so, like, how is that connected? And she said that her parents told her she can't be a Christian and believe in evolution at the same time. At this point, I was a little confused. I asked her, like, do you believe in Jesus? She's like, yes. I said, do you believe in the resurrection? Yes. Do you have a personal relationship with Jesus? Yes. And then it kind of clicked for me. Okay, you believe that you have to choose between science and faith. And she said, yes. And let me tell you why my heart broke in this moment, because here's this young girl who was ready to walk away from the faith because of something that Christians for centuries have been arguing about. For centuries, Christians and denominations and theological perspectives argue on how to interpret Genesis 1 through 3. You have some people that say it's very poetic, like Hebrew poetry. You have some people believing in things called like the day-age theory or the gap theory or the literal translation. All these things, like they're really interesting arguments and really interesting conversations, but none of those things are the foundation of our faith. The foundation of our faith, and this led to a really good conversation with this girl's parents, like just how to reconcile what she was dealing with what they believe. The foundation of our faith is Jesus. Amen? The foundation of our faith is the resurrection, to do what Jesus said, to love God and to love others. I love talking about creation. It's a really interesting thing to talk about, to dissect how the Greek or the Hebrew writers meant for that to be taken. But it's as interesting as it is, it's not the foundation of our faith. And what's also heartbreaking is that this young girl is not the only person that I've had these conversations with. She's not the only person who goes through this. I've talked to so many young people, read so many articles, listened to so many podcasts or interviews with people who struggle with the same thing, thinking that they have to choose between faith and science, being told that the two are not compatible. And the results, what I've seen is that it leads to usually two different things. One is people will walk away from the faith that they once professed. But the other thing could be equally as bad. They'll blindly accept maybe what their parents believe and build their faith around a really weak foundation because they just don't reconcile that in their heart. So they just move on with a weak foundation. And as a pastor, both of those things concern me. When I look at the church, specifically in America, there's some things that concern me, that keep me up at night. I want to share with you 3 different stats that, again, as a pastor, just cause me to lose sleep. Here's the first one, is that 2,700 people leave the American church every day. Every single day, 2,700 people make a decision to leave the church. Yet, if you dig down and you poll those same 2,700 people, you'll find that 78% of them still have an interest in the Christian faith. They just don't want anything to do with the American church any longer. And that causes me to ask questions like, okay, what is it about the church that people are leaving, yet they're still interested in Jesus and the Christian faith? Here's another stat. Only 31% of Christians wrestling with their faith thought they could be somewhat or completely open about their beliefs in church. Again, this one concerns me because I think church should be the safest place to learn and wrestle with our faith. I mean, if we can't ask questions here, that's a problem. Because what happens is the questions don't go away, but people go to a different place for the answers. So we have to be open to questions. And then here's the last one. 40 million adults in America today used to go to church, but no longer do. Just to give you a little bit of context, because sometimes you throw out those big numbers and like in the population of America, like what does that actually mean? That is 16% of the population. 16% of the population used to go to church, but no longer do. And there's this trend out there, especially amongst millennials, so those between like mid-20s, the mid-40s, and I'll talk about why in just a moment, but there's this trend out there called deconstructing, where people are kind of deconstructing their faith, questioning everything that they grew up believing about their faith. And of course, it's not just limited to millennials. I know a lot of people who are much older than that going through the same process, people younger than that going through that as well. But when we think about like why millennials, what is it about this age group that is really drawn to this idea of deconstructing? I think part of it is we grew up in a very optimistic generation. We grew up when the American dream was alive and well. We were taught we could trust institutions completely. So we were told if you went to college and got a degree and you take out some student loans, like you'll get your dream job in your dream field and you'll be fine. So we take out some student loans, and sometimes it worked out, sometimes it didn't. But like it kind of caused us like, oh, should I have trusted my guidance counselor in high school? Like I thought this was financial aid, but it's a loan. Like I got to pay this back. What? So we had that, and then we kind of grew up and we were becoming adults during the housing crisis. My first full-time job was in collections for a bank. Kind of a big jump from like collections to pastor, but I got a front row seats at kind of the destruction of what like these institutions were doing with some of the lending practices. I could go on and on about institutions we were raised to trust, only to learn they weren't as trustworthy as we thought. But the list is long, right? So this has left my generation, and maybe you too, questioning just about everything. We began to deconstruct our views of institutions. We became a very skeptical generation, a generation that is slow to trust. And it would be natural to ask the question, did the church do any better? Did the institution of the church do any better than all these other institutions that I thought were good, but then I found out like the motives weren't as good as I thought? Did the church do any better than the banks, than the media, than the government, than technology companies, than these other institutions? And unfortunately, the answer has been increasingly no. The answer for so many people, 2,700 people per day, has been no. And sometimes for good reason. I want to give you the top reasons. These are from the same polls before. By the way, these polls come out of a book called The Great Dechurching. It's a book that kind of is trying to analyze why people are walking away from the church. But I want to give you some reasons that people mentioned that they left the church. And I want to give you a word of caution first, though. Because sometimes, and this is kind of my instinct, when I read reasons like this, my instinct is to kind of roll my eyes and think, you know what? If people just thought for themselves, if people just thought a little more critically, maybe they would not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like they're jumping to conclusions and they're just not doing the work. That can be my instinct because even though I've been let down by the church, even though I've been hurt by the church, and when I say church, I mean church in general, not this church. Even though like I've seen things that aren't as good in the church in general, I still love the church. Obviously, like I've dedicated my life to serving the church, and I believe it's through the church that God has chosen to reach the world. And if you're like me and your instinct is to roll your eyes, I just want to give us all a word of caution. This is from James, the brother of Jesus, our memory verse for today. It says, "My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry." Quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. If we want to get to the bottom of why people are walking away from the faith, why people are rejecting what we believe to be truth, why our children who we raised in the church and we did everything we could to instill a faith in them and we pray for them every single day, why some of them are choosing to walk away from the faith, we must be better listeners. So when surveying those walking away from the church, here are some of the top reasons people gave. And before I give you the list, let me just say, I think our church does a really good job with these. I think that we're not like the average church that maybe leans into these more. I think we do a really good job at these, but again, I'm biased, so take that for what it's worth. But here's some of the reasons people gave. The first one is this, is the church's emphasis on culture wars. The church's emphasis on culture wars, especially politically, that was mentioned. Now, I know pastors who quit their jobs because they were just sick of dealing with culture wars. Now, you might say, Brian, it's not a culture war, it's a truth war. Again, quick to listen, slow to speak. Whether we believe that or not, this is the real reason that real people are giving for walking away from the church. So it would be irresponsible not to listen. That's the first one. The second one is this: because of the lack of love, joy, gentleness, kindness, and generosity of the church. Man, these are fruits of the Spirit. These are things that should be indicators of Christians, things that actually draw people to the church, draw people to Jesus. And again, I don't think this is true in our church, but this is why people have a negative view of church in general, why people are quick to reject church but still are open to Jesus. The third one is this, is the church's inability to listen. I think the church should be the easiest place for us to come with our questions. We never want to be the kind of church that's not going to listen. I mean, I've had experiences when I was younger of being judged not for something I stated, not for something I said I believed, but simply being judged because of a question I had. I mean, the church should be, again, the easiest place to bring our questions to. Truth should never be afraid of questions, right? Truth always prevails regardless of the question. And then the fourth one is this, is the church's inability to engage in other viewpoints. If what we believe is as powerful as we say it is, then we should be able to engage with other viewpoints and perspectives. And the truth is, we will be able to stand through that. If we feel threatened every time another viewpoint or another perspective is brought up, it makes people wonder, how confident are we really in what we believe? Now, if you fall into any of these categories, if you fall into any of those four I mentioned where like maybe you didn't even want to come here today because of one of these things, maybe you're in the process of deconstructing your faith. Or maybe you've been experiencing doubts or you're not sure where you fall. Let me first say, you are in the right place. You are here during the right series because we will continue to work to be a church that welcomes questions, not shies away from them. And over the next 6 weeks, so this is part 1 of 7 of a series. It's a series called The Reason for God. And this series is based on a book that was written by a man named Tim Keller. Tim Keller was he was a pastor in New York City, an author. And Tim was one of those, he tragically passed away last year after a battle with cancer. Tim was one of those guys that regardless of denomination, regardless of theological bending, he was held in high regard by almost everyone in ministry. He was just one of those guys that people respected his viewpoint. He would speak at any type of conference, regardless of the denomination. He was just held in high regard. And this series, if you haven't figured out by now, is going to be a little bit different than most of the series we do. And it's going to coincide with growth groups that will be a little different than our typical growth groups. During the series, you're going to hear from 4 of our pastors on some real life subjects that likely prevented somebody you love from coming to faith in Jesus. We're going to talk about those things that sometimes as Christians we just hope nobody asks us about, because we might know what we believe, but sometimes it's hard to articulate the answer. We're going to kind of dive headfirst into those topics and talk about them. Some of the topics we're going to talk about is the validity of the Bible. I think that's timely if you're doing the reading plan. We're in Leviticus, and it's like, whoa, what's going on here? We're going to talk about if it's a myth or not, just how the Bible even came to be. We're going to talk about if we really believe there's only one way to God, and other religions and their validity. We're going to talk about why God would allow suffering and evil in this world. We're going to talk about Christian morality and ethics, the whole idea of rules, like why is there rules to be a Christian? We're going to talk about injustice and hypocrisy in the church. And then we're going to talk about God's wrath and judgment, like kind of reconciling the whole idea of God being a loving God, but also God being a vengeful God. Like, how do those work? What does that say about God? And in your groups, you're going to have conversations with people who, some of them are going to be struggling through these things. Some people are going to be confident in what they believe, but part of the group is watching these videos with Tim Keller, sitting down with 6 people who do not believe in the Christian faith. And it's going to serve a few purposes. One is just what a healthy conversation looks like about faith. How someone with so much knowledge, way more knowledge than I'll ever have, how he handles conversations like that. Some of them he talks a lot less than others. Some of them he'll give more answers. But here's our hope with this series and with these groups is that if you're skeptical, you will find a safe place to wrestle with these things. You will find a safe place to have these conversations. And then our other hope is also, if you have a strong faith, that it would strengthen your faith, strengthen why you believe what you believe, but also that it would help us to see through the lens of people with a different worldview. That would allow us to kind of take a step back, put ourselves in their shoes, and just see how other people see things. See how maybe your kids see things, your adult children see things. But for today, what I want to do is simply kind of set the stage for the next 6 weeks. I want to help us understand where people are coming from, why people are leaving the church, and why people are deconstructing. And I also want to make the point that deconstructing is not necessarily a bad thing. Let me give you a definition of deconstructing first when it comes to our faith. Deconstruction is the act of breaking something down into its separate parts in order to understand its meaning, especially when this is different from how it was previously understood. So again, this is not necessarily a negative thing, because sometimes a weak foundation or a rotting foundation, in order to build something on it, we have to tear down what's there first. However, if we tear it down just for the sake of tearing it down, if we tear down our faith just for the sake of walking away from our faith, that would be a negative thing. But if we're doing it for the sake of reconstructing something stronger, it's a positive thing. I want to show you a couple examples in the Bible. In Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, you see Jesus say this phrase several times. His most famous sermon, he says this phrase several times. He says, "You have heard it said, but I say unto you." Meaning, like, you have heard it said one way, especially referring to the Old Testament, but I say unto you. Here's a few examples. First one, Matthew chapter 5, starting verse 21. Jesus says this, he says, "You have heard it was said to people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgments." What is Jesus doing here? He's raising the bar. He's saying that the law wasn't actually placed just to keep people from committing homicide, although that's a good start, right? What was the point of that law? It was actually to point people to love. Verse 27, Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery, but I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Again, what's Jesus doing here? He's raising the bar. He's saying the purpose of this Old Testament law wasn't to keep people from cheating on each other. The purpose of this was to point people towards commitment. He's raising the bar. And then verse 38, he says, "You have heard that it was said, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. If you're doing your reading plan where we do the Old Testament and New Testament, just this past week, we're seeing the story in Matthew of the crucifixion. And one of the things I wrote in my journal was how when Jesus was he was arrested and he's beginning to be beaten for the things he said, the religious leaders, they begin to question him and say, like if you're truly the Son of God, tell us who just slapped you. And what's really interesting is Jesus did not say a word during that. He let his silence speak louder than his words. What was Jesus doing in these examples? He was deconstructing their views of the Old Testament law and reconstructing something stronger. He was building on what they believed. They believed in the Old Testament law. They believed in the law of Moses, but he was kind of deconstructing the meaning and reconstructing something stronger. I want to show you one more example of someone who actually went through the process of deconstructing in the Bible. It's the Apostle Paul. Before writing the books in the Bible that he wrote, and he wrote about half of the New Testament, before planting churches all over, Paul went through a process of deconstruction. If you think about it, the Apostle Paul, before becoming a Christian, he was a Jewish leader. He was trained by one of the most famous Jewish leaders of the first century. He went on to join the Pharisees, which were an elite group of Jewish leaders. Paul would have known the history of his people and the Old Testament more than we could imagine. In fact, he would have known the Old Testament scriptures better than any of Jesus' disciples. He was convinced that his truth was ultimate truth. And then what happened is Paul, he kind of comes face to face with Jesus on the Damascus road, and his life is completely changed. He sees the resurrected Jesus, and then he turns to Christianity. But look at what Paul writes to the church in Galatia. Galatians chapter 1. Paul says, "For you have heard of my previous way of life in Judaism, how intensely I persecuted the church of God and tried to destroy it." So Paul, before he became a Christian, he thought what he believed in was so true that God would even condone violence to stop this group of Christians. It says, "I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people and was extremely zealous for the traditions of my fathers," talking about the Jewish faith. "But when God, who set me apart from my mother's womb and called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son in me so that I might preach him, Jesus, among the Gentiles, my immediate response was not to consult any human being. I did not go up to Jerusalem to see those who were apostles before I was, but I went to Arabia." We're going to come back to that in a moment. "Later, I returned to Damascus. After 3 years, I went to Jerusalem." What did Paul do? He went and he sought God. Everything he believed was kind of like shaken for a moment. And he went and he saw God. Many theologians believe that Paul went to Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai was in Arabia. So Mount Sinai is where God appeared to Moses and gave Moses the 10 Commandments and gave Moses the Old Testament law. Mount Sinai is where Elijah met with God when he was feeling lost and alone and spent 3 years there, learning where he was wrong and where the gospel of Jesus was right and what that meant. Paul, he deconstructed his previous understanding of God and he reconstructed it into something stronger. By the way, not over the course of a podcast, not over the course of one self-help book or one YouTube video, because often we'll hear one thing and it's like that, it changes everything about us. No, this was a 3-year process where Paul, he did the work, he sought God, and he sought what was actually true. And he found a faith that was actually more true to the Old Testament scriptures and the stories he studied his entire life. When I was growing up, I loved God. I loved the church, but my understanding of God, best way I could put it is my understanding of God was incomplete. I had this view of God of kind of like this powerful, angry man sitting on a throne in heaven, never smiled, only scowled, and he was just waiting for me to mess up. He was just waiting for me to make a mistake so he could punish me. I committed my life to Jesus so many times when I was young because I was so afraid of this powerful man upstairs. We had this running joke in my house every time I went to any sort of church camp or youth group night or anything like that. I came home with a new Bible because when you raise your hand to accept Jesus, they give you a Bible. And so I became a Bible collector unintentionally. But for me, every time a preacher would present Jesus and they would say that thing like, if you died tonight, do you know where you would go? Like, hands straight up, like, I need to accept Jesus again. I'm not mocking that. We do that here. I lead people in that prayer all the time. But for me, I did it like every single week. Almost every night when I'm like doing my Bible reading and my prayers, like I would make sure I did it again because I was afraid I didn't say it right the last time or I'd done too many wrong things since the last time. Here's why. Because while I had a relationship with God, it was built entirely on fear. Fear of hell. You ask a 13-year-old kid, you want to go to heaven or hell? Yeah, I'll go to heaven, please. I was afraid of hell. I was afraid of messing up. I had a fear of sinning, fear of making God angry, fear of being punished by God. And a religion built on fear leads to shame. Then it leads to pride. Then it leads to legalism. Legalism often leads to rebellion, which I went through. In fact, you could sum up my teen years by those words: fear, shame, pride, legalism, and rebellion. But just like the prodigal son went back to the Father, I eventually made my way back to God. But I had a little deconstructing to do along the way. I didn't do it for the sake of destroying my faith or walking away from the faith. I did it because when you have a rotting foundation, you have to tear some things down before you can build it back up. And so what I did, I searched. I searched the scriptures. I did research. I prayed. I fasted. I sought God with all my heart. And I reconstructed a faith that was so much more real than when I was young. And by the way, I still do that on a regular basis. I say the foundation is strong now. It's not going anywhere, but sometimes you need to knock a wall down. Sometimes you need to tear up some flooring, redo a room. I'm constantly learning and strengthening and staying fresh with my relationship with God. So as we end today, a few categories you might fall in. Some of us, we might be in the middle of that deconstruction process. Maybe the faith that we were handed as kids that our parents believed in, maybe like you just have questions, you have doubts, like you no longer just want to take their word for it. You want to kind of figure out what you actually believe. Or maybe you were hurt by the church or someone who claimed to love God and love you, and you've slowly begun to tear down what was there. Maybe intentionally, maybe unintentionally. If that's you, like it was me, like it was Paul, I'd say tear down what you need to tear down, but don't walk away from the house. I mean that metaphorically and literally. Like, don't walk away from the project of your faith, but also don't walk away from this house. Because again, we want to create a place, and we're committed to creating a place where we can handle our questions, we can handle our doubts. So don't walk away from the house. Do the work. Deconstruct for the sake of reconstruction. Build a better, healthier, more resilient foundation. Maybe you deconstructed years ago. Maybe you deconstructed decades ago. It's never too late to begin building again. Others of us, maybe we are in the stage of reconstruction. If this is you, keep going. Press in. The work is worth it. Seek God. Be like Mary who studied at the feet of Jesus, studied at the feet of a rabbi. Grow your faith. Join a growth group. Serve the church. Do what you can to stretch and to build your foundation. And then there's others of us, and maybe this is the majority, I don't know, who are thinking, you know what, this message is not really for me, Pastor. I have a strong foundation. I know what I believe in. I'm secure in my faith. And if that's you today, amazing. Like, again, I'm right there with you. I think I have a strong faith and I'm secure in my foundation as well. But it would be irresponsible of us to ignore the experiences and the process of other people. I've talked to so many parents of teens, parents with adult children who pray on a daily basis for their kids, who pray on a daily basis for their grandkids that they would come back to their faith. Sometimes they blame things like the education system or media or just the generation as a whole. Let's be a people, again, quick to listen, slow to speak. Let's be a people of empathy who can understand where they're coming from, understand just how different generations are conditioned in different ways, and be quick to listen to them. Help them deconstruct if they need to. Help them reconstruct when they're ready. To listen, to not blame it just, they just need more faith. No, let's help them do the work to help tear down what needs to go and reconstruct something that will last and isn't just believing because someone else told them to. And not only that, but if we have a strong faith and a strong foundation, God calls us to continue to build on that, to continue to construct, always learning, always becoming more like Jesus. So regardless of where you are, this series, this growth group semester is for you. Again, this is week 1 of 7. This is just setting the stage for the next 6 weeks. This series, this growth group is for you. Would you pray with me? Father, I thank you so much for this church, for here, for Medina, God, just the people that you've called to this place. God, I thank you for these stories in the Bible of Paul who was so confident in what he believed in, yet he was still open-minded enough to hear from you, Jesus, and how his life was radically changed. And God, we believe you are still doing that today. God, I pray that this can be a place that we can be a people that welcomes people like Paul, that welcomes people who have their doubts, that have their questions. God, that we can continually point people to you. Just like John the Baptist prepared the way for the Lord, may we be a people that prepares people's hearts for what you can do in them. So God, I pray for the series that you would bless it, that you would be with our growth group and our growth group leaders as we engage in these conversations. And I just pray for the next 6 weeks here at One Church. God, we love you so much, and it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Pastor.